Howdy, y'all. Welcome back. Thank you for being here. Outstanding doesn't begin to explain this panoramic shot of Lisbon, Portugal, dated to the 19th century. Old world for miles, it appears without a single steel building, yet the entire landscape is built out. Nothing is obtrusive or obtuse. Everything appears meticulously planned down to the last streetlight and sidewalk. However, within the current narrative history, through layers of facade and fabrication, diving into countless tales of winners and losers which have helped shape the intricate, if not convoluted, history of Lisbon, we find nearly as many mysteries as we do historical facts. The story of Lisbon seems to be one shrouded in myth, blended with fact, and the curiously detailed architecture of this epic capital of Portugal only adds to our wonderment. Who built this city? Where did these thousands of unique masonry, stone, and brick structures come from? Is the infrastructure of the city, as it appears, interconnected? And if so, what other technologies could we find hidden in 19th century Lisbon? Hopefully, this collection of over 130 old world images will help to satiate our appetite. As we browse the photographs, we will take a stroll through the annals of the current narrative, discussing what historians and scholars alike have argued for centuries, the origins of Lisbon, which was once one of the largest and most intricate star forts on the Iberian Peninsula. Lisbon began as an occupied location more than 30,000 years ago, which already begs the question, did these early Neanderthals, often depicted as simple hunters and gatherers, leave behind any traces of architecture or infrastructure in this area? The answer, somewhat unsurprisingly, is no, according to the modern narrative. Yet, the very next people to enter the land, the precursors to modern man, some 25,000 years ago, who pushed the Neanderthal to extinction, are said to have left behind massive monoliths and dolmens similar in nature to Stonehenge, as well as intricate stone burial chambers which dot the infrastructure at the core of Lisbon today. Again, this begs the question, did modern man's early ancestors perhaps work with the Neanderthals in designing and erecting these creations throughout ancient Iberia? By the time of antiquity, we're told that Lisbon has a significant permanent population, holding a strategic location on the river Tagus, that being the longest river which quite literally weaves and cuts through the majority of modern Portugal. According to Bronze Age legends, Lisbon was founded by Odysseus, the mythical king from Homer's The Odyssey. Some Iberian scholars claim the first inhabitants of this land to be titled Extremneos, or the people of the far west. These indigenous Portuguese conducted vast maritime, travel, and trade, creating fortifications throughout central and southern Portugal. By the year 1000 BC, we have the first Indo-Aryan people entering the Iberian Peninsula, the infamous Celts. By the 1st century BC, the Celtic people had intermarried and intermingled with the people of Iberia, creating the distinct tribe known as Sempsi or Cephis or Ophis, the people of the snakes or the serpent people. Thus, Iberia became known to the Greeks as Ophiussa, or land of the serpent people. However, somewhat contradicting this part of the narrative, modern archaeology of Lisbon has revealed Phoenician presence in the area since at least the year 1200 BC. We're told officially the oldest fortifications in Lisbon, sitting on Castello Hill, date to the 2nd century BC. However, recent excavations reveal Iron Age Phoenician occupation, with Phoenician architecture said to be directly below the Castle of St. Jorge and the Lisbon Cathedral, just to name a few. Indications would then be pointed towards Lisbon and the seafaring traders of the earliest history being an amalgamation of indigenous Iberians, Indo-Aryan Celtic people, and the mysterious Phoenicians. Essentially, we're told the Phoenicians rose to a near unified world power after an event known as the Bronze Age Collapse, the 12th century BC simultaneous failing of nearly every major world power at that time. The Phoenicians, essentially the first unified seafaring people, are claimed to be one of the 4 Canaanite tribes. In Egypt, each tribe was represented by a different color: white, black, red, and yellow. We have the Phoenicians, who rose to prominence as the explorers, the settlers, the traders of the Canaanite people. Some historians believe the Phoenicians are descended from the Nordic people, relating the root Finn in Phoenicians to Finn as in Finnish or Finland. Still, others claim as the Phoenicians had no term to call themselves, and as their kingdom had no title, but was instead a long linkage of independent city-states, the only overarching term that can be applied to the Phoenicians would be Canaanite. Yet, other Egyptologists and historians, like William F. Albright, have claimed the Phoenicians refer to themselves and their homeland as Put, as told in the Honeyman inscription. The Phoenician alphabet is the earliest known fully formed alphabet existing on Earth. Greek legends say that the Phoenician prince Cadmus introduced the Phoenician alphabet to Greece, which in return led to Phoenician becoming the dominant alphabet system worldwide. Also, alphabet is a conjuncture of alpha and beta, if you did not know. But I digress. While many claim the Phoenician alphabet arose in the 11th century BC, we actually have an even earlier Proto-Phoenician, Proto-Canaanite, found on inscriptions in Bethlehem and in other Hittite sites in the 12th and 13th centuries BC. By the 9th century BC, Phoenician and variations of the alphabet included Greek, Old Italic, Hebrew, and Old Aramaic. The miraculous nature of the alphabet, where one letter represented one sound, revolutionized language and learning, making reading and writing the language accessible as it only required memorization of a small number of symbols. In comparison, the only other written scripts at the time were cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs, both of which employed long, complex characters for writing, which required years of training to become proficient, limiting access of the writing system to only the smartest and the most elite. The Phoenician language and its simplicity not only allowed its easy adaptation to multiple other languages, but it also allowed the common people to learn how to write. This upset the long-standing status of literacy as an exclusive achievement of royal and religious elites, and completely destroyed the social status of the ancient world. At Karnak, the many obelisks point to Phoenicia, or the land of the Phoenicians, being called Phoenix, written in Phoenician as the letters F, N, H, W. This appears to be a synonym for builder, carpenter, or architect, showcasing how the Phoenicians, this mysterious caste of the first men, not only built the language that we speak today, but they quite literally built the cities as well. The Phoenicians were renowned for their architectural prowess. In Greece, the term phoenix would then go on to mean a person from Phoenicia, as well as a term to represent Tyrian or Phoenician purple, one of the rarest colored dyes in the world at that time, as well as meaning a date palm or a palm tree. We're told Phoenicia also produced the lapis lazuli for a majority of the world, being responsible then for both the earliest representations of blue and purple in art. And the major cities of Phoenicia included Tyre, Beirut, and Byblos, all of which conducted influential trade with Lisbon by the first millennia BC. It was during this time that the massive fortifications which line Lisbon, some visible, some below the surface, were constructed. In understanding the Phoenicians or their abilities as architects, we must assume Lisbon was a vast trade center for the early Celtic and Phoenician people, and in a short matter of time, the population of Lisbon became an amalgamation of both. Interesting, by the time of the Roman conquest, we're told that the name Olisipo, as Lisbon was known, actually stemmed from a language known as Tartessian. Little is known of the Tartessian language or people, but I found the name Tartessian to be eerily similar to our favorite lost society, Tartarian. According to currently accepted history, during the Second Punic War, Rome had defeated Hannibal, Carthage, and the Phoenicians. By 206 BC, the Phoenician hold on the Iberian Peninsula was broken. By 138 BC, Lisbon, or Olisipo, was integrated into the Roman Empire as the Romans sought Lisbon's assistance, as Lisbon was militarily, artistically, and financially important to conquering the greater parts of the Iberian Peninsula. The forces of Lisbon joined the Roman Empire in battle against the mainly Celtic forces of northern Iberia. Lisbon was then officially named a Roman municipality, either by Octavius or by Julius Caesar himself. And from around 65 BC, the population of Lisbon was around 30,000 people, the majority of which are said to have lived inside the city's massive fortifications. These fortifications were often renovated and extended throughout history, leaving us with much to question about the origin of this construction. However, the walls which surrounded Lisbon had become an intricate series of star forts by the early 16th century, but more on that in just a moment. We're told during this Roman occupation, Lisbon remained a dominant city for Iberian control. However, numerous great earthquakes shook the city to its core, destroying many aspects of the pre-Roman architecture. This included earthquakes in the year 60 BC, at least a dozen more from 47 BC through 44 BC, at least 2 more in 33 AD, and said to be the strongest quake of them all, which occurred in 382 AD. During these times, Lisbon was often rebuilt, mainly through the funds it achieved as a trade city, famous for the horses it produced as well as the fish sauce, known as garum, said to be the finest in the world. After Rome began its steep decline that led to its subsequent fall, Lisbon appeared as one of the major cities to struggle with the power vacuum that was created. Feudal systems arose, which themselves fragmented Iberia. Numerous groups invaded Lisbon in the years following the fall of Rome, including the Alans, numerous Germanic tribes, and even the Huns. Each of these groups was said to have destroyed Lisbon and the ancient walls. By the 5th century, the Vandals had captured Lisbon. This was followed by the Visigoths, who went on to unify the whole of the Iberian Peninsula, creating the larger Visigothic kingdom. During this time, Lisbon had many merchants who fled to the area, creating large communities on the outskirts of the city of Greeks, Syrians, and Jews, who would go on to shape day-to-day life in Lisbon. However, we're told by the 8th century, these merchants and the constant pillaging and plundering of the ancient Roman structures of Lisbon had reduced the city to little more than an abandonment. By 711, a civil war had broke out within the Visigothic kingdom, leading to Tariq bin Zayed, a Muslim Berber leader, and his Moorish army invading Iberia. By 714, the Moors had taken Lisbon. By all accounts, the Muslim community transformed Lisbon into one of the largest and most important cities in Europe. By the year 725, we're told Lisbon was several times larger than London or Paris, with a population of at least 5 times these other major cities. Most of the former Roman citizens of Lisbon had adopted the Arabic language, while still being allowed to practice their original faith. The Jewish community in Lisbon was massive and influential, raising Lisbon's economy to one of the most successful in the world. Lisbon was famous for its horses, fish, salt, spices, herbs, dried fruit, honey, and rare furs, which they traded internationally on a daily basis. Another major aspect to the culture of Lisbon and the greater Iberian area at the time of Moorish control were the slaves of Eastern Europe. These men served more as mercenaries, being gifted the rank of soldier, serving the Moorish leadership in battle, and then earning their freedom after a successful campaign. A vast majority of these newly freed Slavic men would go on to take Lisbon as their home, adding to a vast diversity in the population. By the year 750, Lisbon had nearly been entirely reconstructed as a sprawling fortified Muslim city, complete with high city walls, a star fort, a large mosque, a castle on the mound or tell of the city, a medina or urban center to the city, as well as an alcazar or a royal castle for the city's leadership. However, around this same time, a rebellion had begun amongst the Berber and Moorish architects and elite, and this rebellion spread from Iberia into northern Africa. When the Abbasid Revolution took place in 750, Abd al-Rahman fled from Damascus to southern Iberia, where he established the Emirate of Cordoba. which included Lisbon. With the Reconquista, the opulent city of Lisbon became a target. By 796, multiple Christian forces had attempted to retake Lisbon. However, it wasn't until 844 when the city truly fell. We're told in that year, a large brigade of Viking longships had landed in Lisbon, and 13 days later, the Scandinavians had captured the city. It was during this time that the townspeople of Lisbon were said to refuse any Viking leadership, even going as far as destroying their own homes and buildings in Lisbon until the Vikings eventually left the city. Following these numerous Christian and pagan raids, Lisbon became home to multiple Islamic sects dedicated to converting or removing the Anglo-Roman population. This created a caste system, which would then rule over Lisbon for the next several hundred years. The blood relatives of Muhammad were at the top of this system, followed by the full-blooded Arabs, followed by the Berbers and the Moors, followed by the Arabized Muslims, followed by the Roman converts, followed by, finally, the Anglo-Romans who refused to convert, who were then to be removed from the land. Lisbon was captured briefly in 851 by Asturias and again in 966 by Vikings, only to be quickly recaptured by the Arab forces soon after. By the year 1000, the Emirate of Cordoba had become the Caliphate of Cordoba, and this still included Lisbon. However, this caliphate began to fragment. As the control of Lisbon, or the caliphate in general, teetered between the two closest nearby kingdoms, Lisbon used this power struggle to gain much independence and autonomy. By 1111, a new pan-Hispanic caliphate was founded by Ali bin Yusuf, which also included Lisbon. However, caliphate rule in Iberia was quickly put to an end by the Order of the Knights Templar. Here's where we get to a really interesting tidbit of this history. The whole way back in 868, during the reconquest of Iberia, the city of Porto, also known then as Port of Call or Portugal, was captured by Christian forces. However, it wasn't until Portugal separated from the Kingdom of Leon in 1139 that the independent Kingdom of Portugal was born. During the Crusades in 1137, Alfonso I attempted to besiege Lisbon, but failed due to the massive fortified Starfort walls. Then, in 1140, Crusaders returned, but again they failed to breach the walls. Then, from June to July of 1147, with over 164 boats of soldiers, including English and Norman men, the Crusaders returned to Lisbon. Initially knocked off course by the weather, the Crusaders engaged in one of the most infamous sieges of all time. The Crusaders surrounded the city of Lisbon by sea and set up multiple massive siege engines by land, including catapults and over 50-foot tall siege engines. For the most part, this was to no avail, as the city was so well defended, even being surrounded did nothing to breach the walls of Lisbon. This is when legend tells us that Martim Monez, a Portuguese crusader, began to stake out the castle doors of Lisbon. Noticing the intervals when Moorish troops exited through the massive doors, Martim Monez then apparently timed a moment where he, followed by his troops, could leap into the giant doors. He is said to have jarred himself in the doors, sacrificing his body to make the Moorish army unable to seal the doors to the castle, allowing the rest of his men to march over his corpse into the Starfort. We're told eventually the Moors capitulated and the city of Lisbon was plundered and looted, even against the wishes of the victorious Portuguese king. By November the 1st of that same year, 1147, the Great Mosque of Lisbon was converted to a great cathedral, with Gilberto of Hastings, a crusader, appointed the first bishop of Lisbon. After conquering the city, Alfonso I heard stories that the powerful relics of Saint Vincent had been buried somewhere near the city. Although not found by Alfonso, in the year 1176, a huge murder of crows was seen flying over a specific area of Lisbon where Saint Vincent's relics were discovered. It said these crows then followed the merchant ship carrying the relics the whole way back to the port at the heart of Lisbon. and thus the crow was chosen to adorn the city's coat of arms. Nowadays, we're told no crows are to be found in Lisbon. By the year 1179, Alfonso had also re-established Lisbon as a trade hub and capital. The Christian and Jewish merchants of Lisbon, now free to worship and trade in peace, quickly transformed Lisbon into the trade center of Iberia, re-establishing old, forgotten trade routes with Seville, Cadiz, and Constantinople, but also creating brand new routes with the majority of Europe. Lisbon became the conduit for trade throughout the Mediterranean, and eventually the trade of Lisbon became interconnected with the trade of Africa as well, only adding to the gross national product of both. They exchanged Portuguese olive oil, salt, wine, cork, honey and wax, as well as wool and fine linen, tin, iron, dyes, amber, guns, furs, artisanal works for the spices, silks, herbal remedies, in addition to gold, ivory, rice, almonds, and sugar. Shipyards were founded throughout Lisbon to build more commercial and military vessels for the Armada, essential to protect all of this trade. By the 13th century, this trade had led to the first truly seaworthy Atlantic sailing ship, capable of sailing around the world, being created in Lisbon. These caravels, as they were known, were the amalgamation of centuries of Christian, Viking, and Moorish seafaring knowledge. In the year 1256, seeing the advantage of the largest and wealthiest city being the capital, Alfonso III moved the capital of the Kingdom of Portugal to Lisbon. During the reign of Alfonso III and many of his successors, we have the reclaiming of much land across Lisbon, including today's Commerce Square, which once sat submerged beneath the sea. Political tensions between Lisbon and Castile were counterbalanced by an alliance made in 1308 by King Denis between Portugal and England, Portugal's main trading benefactor. During the 100 Years' War, for example, Portugal and England fought on one side, on the other, France and Castile. By 1373, the Spanish had invaded and destroyed most of Lisbon, although the Spanish left without fully conquering the city. Due to this breach, an additional set of star fort or massive fortified walls, known as the Great Fernandine Walls, were created around the city. However, little could be done to stop the great earthquakes which continued to devastate and wash away parts of Lisbon. This included quakes in 1290, 1318, 1321, 1334, 1337, 1344, 1346, another in 1356, another in 1366, 1395, and another in 1404, each of which destroyed hundreds of buildings and took the lives of many people. This was accompanied by a great famine that began in Lisbon in 1333, which was followed by a series of Black Plague outbreaks in Lisbon, beginning in 1348. All of these events are said to have severely reduced the trade and growth of Portugal's largest merchant city and capital. By 1383, we have the Portuguese Civil War, which began when King Ferdinand of Portugal died without any male heirs. His kingdom was then passed to King John of Castile. As we mentioned earlier, Portugal and Castile appeared for much of early history as sworn enemies, so for Portugal to be handed to Castile was a major blow for the Portuguese. The landowners, the royalty, and the aristocrats of Portugal actually supported the crown of Castile, as Castile had supported a feudal system where the elite would benefit. However, the merchants of Lisbon, being the capital of Portugal, sought to keep Portugal out of the hands of Castile, as a Castilian rule would sever all ties between Portugal and England and would most likely cut established links between the Lisbon merchants and the rest of the European world. In the end, the combined forces of Lisbon and England defeated Castile, culminating in the 1384 siege of Lisbon, an embarrassing defeat for the Castilians. The Castilians simply could not breach the walls of Lisbon, the miraculous star fort seemingly being undefeated all time. Within the first few days of the siege, the army of Castile broke out in plague, and just months after arriving in Lisbon, the Castile army had fled entirely. We're told the city, after the Portuguese Civil War, began to greatly expand. Somewhere along the lines, the irrigation techniques that were utilized by the Moorish people were forgotten by the new Portuguese, who resorted to importing much of their produce and food from France, the Rhineland, and Morocco. Lisbon and Antwerp, Belgium, became a sort of twin cities for trade on the Atlantic European coast. We're told by the early 1400s, systems were put into place in Lisbon to clean up the streets and remove the homeless. This culminated in many hospitals and almshouses being founded in the area. Lisbon was also home to a vast formation of spies, utilized from the 15th century onward to secretively keep track of the Ottoman Empire. As the Ottomans had conquered North Africa, Egypt, and the Middle East, they threatened the free trade of Lisbon, which quickly began to decline. The merchants of Lisbon, many directly related to Jews and Muslims of northern Africa, reacted by seeking to negotiate directly with the source of their goods, rather than using Ottoman intermediaries. Since many of Lisbon's merchants had a familiarity with the area, they were able to learn the source of their goods were mainly caravans crossing the Sahara Desert from Sudan. The Lisbon merchants not only sent their ships and their people directly to Sudan, circumventing the Ottoman Empire, but they used their negotiations in Sudan, as well as their ties with the Order of Christ, to effectively keep track of Ottoman trade in the area. By the time of Alfonso V, roughly 1470, we have Lisbon monopolizing the private sector of Portugal, giving control to one Fernão Gomes, under the auspices that he explore 100 leagues south of North Africa every year for the next 5 years, which added to the growing territory of Portugal. By 1580, we again have a succession crisis in Portugal. Sebastian of Portugal was said to have died in 1578 without any heirs, so his great uncle, Henry of Portugal, was then named king. When Henry died just 2 years later, also without any heirs, the true crisis began. Many claimed the throne of Portugal, but it was only Felipe II of Castile who was named king, beginning the union of Spain and Portugal, known as the Iberian Union. 3 kings named Felipe from the House Habsburg would then go on to rule Portugal and subsequently Lisbon through the year 1640. During this time, the Felipes would utilize the Jewish and Moorish merchants of Lisbon and their direct connections with Sudan and Africa to nearly monopolize the entire Atlantic slave and spice trade, catapulting Lisbon into the forefront of world economy. However, as the Dutch, the French, and the English began to understand and copy the interworkings of Portuguese trade, and as these nations began to attack Portuguese merchants, Portugal's trade power worldwide quickly began to diminish. The Habsburgs had also funneled most of Portugal's wealth out of the country to support the Catholic cause during the 30 Years' War. Eventually, Portugal's economy suffered so directly it had to turn to its new colonies to keep its economy afloat. First India and then Brazil. Many may not know that India was once a Portuguese colony. Meanwhile, the English and the Dutch had also sent soldiers into the New World, as the Portuguese had done previously. Unable to capture the lands they desired from the indigenous people of Mexico and Peru, England and the Netherlands had turned their sights to the weakened colonies of Portugal. The northeast coast of Brazil, the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, Formosa Island in Taiwan, as well as many other Portuguese trade hubs throughout the world were captured. Portuguese economy then suffered severely. With the Spanish Inquisition came the persecution of thousands of merchants of Lisbon, who made up a majority of the people in the land. With the expelling of Jewish and even some Christian merchant families, having already lost much of its fleet in the disaster of the Spanish Armada, as well as paying high taxes to support the armies of the Spanish nobles in Europe, the Portuguese gradually lost their overseas ports and access to all foreign products. By the 17th century, the joint share trading companies of the world took even more business away from the relatively peaceful Portuguese. By 1640, the Portuguese, decimated by tariffs, war, and massive illegal taxation by other nations, initiated the Portuguese Restoration War, regaining independence from Spanish control. The thousands of merchants of Lisbon aligned themselves with the working class, who themselves had a good relationship with the higher nobility. The unified Portuguese ascended Lisbon's Castle Hill on December 1st, 1640, where they declared independence, naming John, Duke of Braganza, as King John IV of Portugal. We're told during the post-Restoration years, when Lisbon still had a failing economy, most of the second and third born sons, and so forth, would join religious orders as the merchant orders could no longer support family members. This led to a vast majority of men and women in Lisbon becoming priests, nuns, or friars. The economy of Lisbon and of Portugal in general was waning. That is, until the discovery of Brazilian gold during the 17th and 18th centuries. During this time, a 1/5 the total price tax was installed on the gold to be paid in gold from Brazil to Portugal, more directly from Brazil to the ruling merchants of Lisbon. With the sudden surge in economy and income, we're told Lisbon was vastly rebuilt in the mid-1700s, with almost 50% of the buildings that we'll look at in today's video having been built during this time. Between 1700 and 1800, an estimated 1,000 tons of gold was sent to Lisbon, with an estimated additional 1,000 tons or more being unaccounted for. We also have over 2.4 million carats of diamonds officially imported to Lisbon from Brazil, with even more being unaccounted for. However, all this, the entire city itself, was said to be reduced to rubble, leaving only infrastructure in the Great Lisbon Earthquake of 1755. This occurred on November 1st, or All Saints' Day of 1755. We're told the first quake struck right before 10 a.m., with a second smaller tremor right at 10, followed by a more destructive quake around noon of that same day. We're told many initially were able to escape the first quake, with most of them leaving their homes after the second tremor. We're told most of the citizens of Lisbon ran away from the city towards the coastline to avoid any additional damage. However, when the third part of the quake struck around noon, it was said to be focused mainly off the coast of Lisbon, which created a massive tsunami and tidal wave which took the lives of nearly every resident that was situated along the coast. Lisbon was said to be covered by over 7 feet of water. Of the royal and luxury government buildings of Lisbon, nearly all of them were lost. Of the 20,000 smaller buildings, including the homes that made up Lisbon, over 17,000 of them were destroyed. And of the 180,000 estimated inhabitants to call Lisbon home, nearly 60,000, or 1/3 of them, lost their lives due to the earthquake and tsunami. From here, the city was said to have somehow rebuilt quickly with the same attention to detail that the ancient city had, seemingly indicating that the earlier infrastructure was reused. Napoleon's forces began a 4-year occupation of Lisbon in December of 1807, and Lisbon descended with the rest of the country into anarchy. After the Peninsula War ended in 1814, a new constitution was proclaimed and Brazil was granted independence. Lisbon continued to be the political center for European Portugal. The 20th century brought political upheaval to Lisbon and the nation as a whole. In 1908, King Carlos of Portugal and his heir, the young Luis Felipe, were assassinated in Lisbon. By October of 1910, attempts to overthrow the government repeatedly hit Lisbon. Between 1910 and 1926, we're told there were over 45 changes of government instituted in Portugal. Then, by 1926, the far-right Estado Novo regime took power in Portugal, a position it held for nearly 50 years until 1974. This was followed by the Carnation Revolution, restoring Portugal to a democracy while withdrawing Portugal from its African colonies. Then, from 1974 onward, we're told Portugal and Lisbon, especially, experienced a vast influx of migration from these African colonies that were formerly Portuguese. By 1986, Portugal had joined the European Union, with Lisbon's infrastructure used to spur redevelopment of Greater Portugal. By 1994, Lisbon was the official European City of Culture for that year. In 1998, the Expo, or World's Fair, was held in Lisbon, and in 2004, the European Football Championships were held in Lisbon. From 2006 through today, Lisbon is experiencing a time of revitalization focused on gentrifying the oldest and most dilapidated parts of the city. And from here, we've now reached modern times. I usually won't give you the history right up until our current moment in time, but in the case of Lisbon, I felt it was prudent to share all the information from prehistory to modern times. So hopefully you enjoyed this video, hopefully you were able to learn something, and hopefully you at least saw some really interesting, really unbelievable, really amazing architecture in some of these photographs. If you did, please like, please subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and feel free to donate to my channel if you'd like. But most of all, please share this video of what you learned and saw today to anyone who enjoys this type of history. Sharing my work is the best and sometimes the only way to get this information and these amazing photographs out to the greater public. So I thank you all so much for being here, for helping me and my channel to reach 71,000 subscribers. I'm doing this really all by myself. All the work is done by me. The voiceovers, the video editing, the collecting of the pictures, the contacting museums, etc., etc. So I just appreciate all of you being here with me and sharing this moment with me. I appreciate all of you, and I look forward to hearing from you and hearing what you have to say about Old World Lisbon, about the history of Portugal, about anything. Let me know in the comments down below, and we will talk more about it on the next video. Thank you so much. Cheers, y'all.